About 50 years ago, an astronaut returning from the moon experienced things that he couldn't find a scientific explanation for. So, with some colleagues, he launched a new science focused on the mind and how it works in the body and across space and time. It's the field of Noetics, where the tools of modern science are used to help us understand how what we think and feel affects us and the world around us. Now, this is Dr. Ruth Miller's Noetic Moments from the studios of KXCR Community Radio in Florence, Oregon.
Hello there, and welcome to Noetic Moments. Nous is the Greek term for mind or awareness, and noetics is the field of research that explores and explains what consciousness is, what it does, how it works, and how our lives could be very different if we understood it better. I'm Ruth Miller, your host, and through this series of programs, I'm sharing some of the history, explaining some of the ideas and experiments, and introducing some of the people whose work has defined this field of research. We'll also take your questions and explore some news items. Now, over the last couple of weeks, we've begun a 12-part series on evolving models of consciousness, the history of explorations and discoveries of what the mind is and how it works. You can catch up on them on our website, www.noeticmoments.org, if you haven't already streamed them or heard them here on KXCR FM Community Radio. And if you did catch an earlier show, you may remember that we generally have two ways of thinking about consciousness. In the world of medicine and psychology, consciousness is usually thought of as being awake, aware, knowing what's going on around us. We are conscious when we are awake, right? In the field of noetics, though, it's emerged, as it has emerged over the past 100 years, consciousness is processes and products of the mind, both in our awareness and outside of it. It's also profound human experiences, and ultimately, consciousness is what connects us all. And we're exploring in this series how that idea of what noetics is and what mind is and what consciousness is has emerged and been demonstrated through a number of very rigorous experiments. Now, last time we got together, I talked about Sigmund Freud, who opened the door to the scientific understanding of processes of mind in the early 1900s, with his model of conscious and unconscious processes operating in the body, in the mind, as the id, the ego, and the superego interacting and leading to sometimes physiological as well as psychological results. I also introduced some of the ideas of Carl Jung, who went beyond Freud. He saw that our job as human beings is to develop our own individual consciousness within the framework of what he called the collective consciousness, the images, the thoughts, and the beliefs around us, which he called archetypes. Now today, we're going to explore the work of Charles Tart, who laid out a very different model quite a bit later. I've jumped ahead in time. I'll go back and fill it in. But it's to help us understand this idea of what he called states of consciousness. Tart was teaching psychology in California University during the 1960s and 70s when, as some of you know, many students were exploring the effects of drugs on their experience. I'm guessing some of my listeners might have been some of those people. They were asking questions he didn't have answers for in the traditional psychology, so he began a series of experiments to help define what they were experiencing and why. His early work focused on the capacities of mind, whether mind could affect matter or two minds could share the same thoughts. He published the results of his experiments in a book called Psi, PSI, Scientific Studies of the Psychic Realm. The latest version of that came out in 1977. I had seen an earlier version of it, but I think it's thoroughly out of print now. Using rigorous scientific methods, he demonstrated that the mind is capable of doing far more things than the traditional psychology and medicine model have allowed for. His experiments showed that what they could do varied depending on what he called states of consciousness. As he observed his students experimenting with different drugs, he also realized that there are many different states of consciousness, that we are not just either aware or not aware, but that we may be aware of different things in different ways depending on the state of consciousness we're in. And Tart ultimately likened our normal waking consciousness to a form of hypnotic trance. He discussed how each of us is, from birth, inducted into the trance of the society around us, growing up in the culture and having your mind shaped by the culture. Initially, he called these various states of consciousness altered states, giving us a framework for talking about drug experiences, such as those his students were having, or experiences under various forms of anesthetic, when we might be conscious but not feeling certain things. Our normal state of thinking and acting, being awake and aware and knowing what's going on, is one state of consciousness. And then he talked about altered states with heightened awareness, greater depths of perception, and an expanded sense of connection. He also talked about states of consciousness that were dark and had perceptions that induced fear, seeing dreadful things where normal consciousness would not perceive at all. And in that state, he would also observe people feeling very isolated and disconnected and increasingly fearful. Those might be considered two extreme forms with many states in between. Over time, as he cataloged more and more states of consciousness, he gave up the idea of a normal state and came up with what he called a set of discrete states of consciousness, each of which has its own chemical and emotional signatures, as well as its own thought processes and actions.
I think it's much easier to understand enlightenment if we start at the opposite end of the spectrum and talk about endarkenment.
Okay.
You ever have one of those days where at the end of the day you think, I screwed up so badly, I didn't pay attention to what was happening, I said totally irrelevant things, I committed myself to the wrong stuff, I was so stupid and out of it.
Have you been following me around?
No, I'm just making a general human observation. We've all had days like that, or moments like that. Now, we've all had other days in which we've felt, I was really sharp today, right? I was there for what was necessary. I used my resources and abilities skillfully and so forth. There's a continuum from really dumb, out of it, lousy functioning to really good stuff. When people talk about enlightenment, they're talking about being up at the high end of that continuum, and usually they're implying something more. Usually when the spiritual traditions talk about enlightenment, they're talking about something special, like an altered state of consciousness being added to just ordinary good functioning. But I have a great deal of difficulty with having it talked about that way, okay? I understand you need to. There are certain things that if you haven't experienced them, you can't really communicate them to other people, and so people talk about the feeling of being enlightened, and it's all very mysterious and we can't understand, but there's no other way to talk about it. But at the same time, if you want to encourage people, I find it more useful to talk about this spectrum of enlightenment and darkenment, and talk about how to get up toward the high end more often, how to be more present, more mindful, more open, more effective, more compassionate, because we can do that. We know that if we make enlightenment some absolute thing, right? Here's this perfect human being now who never makes a mistake, who always does everything right. Well, that's not us, and so we just get discouraged, right? So why even try? But if we realize there's some moments when we're each relatively enlightened, we're really up there, and other times when we're not, then we can talk about trying to grow toward that sort of thing. So putting on a continuum like that to me makes more sense.
And Charles goes on in various places to explain what those states on that continuum might be. For many of us interested in the nature of mind and consciousness, Tart's work was a breakthrough. It gave us a framework for understanding not only drug-induced states, but the normal processes of thought and action going on inside us and in the people around us, as well as establishing a protocol for rigorous experimentation around what are usually called paranormal abilities. Tart's work became the basis for a lot of other experiments, and of course it's been widely criticized by people whose model of consciousness required that it be limited to what goes on inside a skull. But again and again, people have been able to repeat his experiments, get similar results, and we will talk more about some of those experiments as we go forward. So as we pay attention to what Tart had to offer, it might be useful to look at the dimensions that he was exploring when he talked about different states. He's talking, first of all, about attention. What is it that we are focusing on? He's talking about perception. What do we perceive and how do we perceive it? He talks about imagery and fantasy. What are the kinds of things that come into our inner awareness and our inner speech patterns? He talks about memory. What do we remember? In different states of consciousness, we remember different things. And then he talks about what are called higher level thought processes. Those are the kinds of, logical and curious places that we go in our thinking. We may be very logical and precise in some states of consciousness and far less so in others. He also suggests that meaning or significance of the experience is different depending on the state of consciousness we're in. And you are probably familiar with a state of consciousness where you're very task-oriented and the things that you're aware of on your peripheral are hardly meaningful at all, whereas there are other states of consciousness where it's as if every single event you possibly experience has deep meaning. The experience of time. We've all had different times that go very quickly and others that go very slowly. And I'm told that for some people, when they're on marijuana, time tends to go very slowly. And there are other times as well. You know how it is when you're bored or when you're waiting for something. It goes very slowly. Number 9 in his list of things is emotional feeling and expression. Certain states of consciousness invite ecstasy and others invite rage or depression or distress of various kinds, fear. He talks about arousal. To what extent are we engaged? Are we excited? Do we have a lot of energy or not? Self-control. In some states of consciousness, we are totally in control, and in others, for example, when we've had too much to drink, our self-control is somewhat limited, shall we say. His 12th point is suggestibility. The actual definition of being in a hypnotic state is that you are highly suggestible. What someone says with a certain voice of authority or persuasion goes right straight in and you accept it when you're in that suggestible state of consciousness. The body image, what we think of as our body, how big it is, how small it is, how far it extends, how tiny we might be in the universe, again, is related to the state of consciousness we're in. And ultimately, all of this is our sense of personal identity, our sense of who we are and what it is that we are able to be and do in this world is defined by which state of consciousness that we are in. And an effective way to talk about them is that each state is a particular pattern of these 12 different aspects of being. So that some states of consciousness are lots of perception and lots of arousal and lots of meaning, and other states of consciousness are far less than that. And as he suggested in that recording from YouTube, there is a continuum, and we are never stuck in one state or another. It is not just a binary process. And it's for these reasons, because of this precision and clarity, that many of us rely heavily on Tart's work as a place to start, as well as we have on Jung and Freud and some of the other early pioneers in the field of consciousness studies. Okay, now, this is the time in the program where we talk about a book. And of the many books that are out there, I felt as if it was necessary to very early on address a particular book that's an absolutely gorgeous paperback. It's by a man named Michael Kerrigan, Kerrigan. Came out in 2011. It was published in Scotland. And it is called Noetic Science, Exploring the Power of Collective Consciousness. And it's truly a gorgeous book. The spacing, the artwork, almost every page has color photographs on it. The text is relatively clear. It's short paragraphs. Some of the chapter headings are mind and body, the universe within, wisdom of the world. As we go forward, from gods to Gaia, talking about the Gaia hypothesis, death and beyond in the hereafter. And then there's a new chapter, wellness, science and medicine, the mind at ease, meditation, placebo power. There is a lot of really, really good stuff, as I say, beautifully laid out in this book. Potentialities, integrating the conscious and the physical, talking about the noosphere, which was a concept that Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, a Catholic priest who was a paleontologist and a philosopher, suggested and wrote about in several books, the noosphere, and was one of the reasons Noetics was called Noetics. He talks about mind and matter. He talks about evolution. And again, all of the graphics are lovely. Unfortunately, the very last section is something that kind of spoils the book for me. In the conclusion, he basically ignores all of the very rigorous and says that, I'm going to quote, we all have to make up our own minds as individuals as far as the possibilities. It is important that we consider the available evidence as we can and think things through. He says in his conclusion, so where have our investigations brought us? Is the noetic science for real? He says, if we're honest, we have to acknowledge that even now we still don't know. It's easier to be certain of the negatives. He's not accepting the results that have actually been generated as demonstrating this. So be aware. It's a fabulous book, a great introduction, but you might want to take the conclusions with a grain of salt. All right, so now is our time to explore what's going on in the world around us. And what I want to suggest is that what Tart helps us to understand is that the body and the mind are welded together in what he called states of consciousness. And some of those states of consciousness are distressing, and some of them are wonderful. And on that continuum that he laid out, what we have seen over the years since he did that research, and to some extent before that if one is in one of those states of consciousness which is distressing, what he called endarkenment, one's immune system is not nearly as effective as when one is in one of those states of consciousness in the direction of what he called enlightenment. The immune system of the body is enhanced the more we experience love, light, beauty, joy, etc. In fact, being in love is perhaps the highest immune state the body can have. So we tend to think of the body and the mind being a single system. I call it the body-mind system. So as the emotional and feeling state of the body is in a higher level, then the immune system of the body is also in a higher level. So this bacteria, these viruses, whatever it is that's in the environment has less of an impact on the body as our state of consciousness is elevated. And we will have a harder time, the body will have a harder time fighting off bacterium or a virus or whatever in the environment if the state of consciousness is moving in the direction of what Tart called endarkenment in that interview. So it's worth it to pay attention. What is my state of consciousness right now? Do I really want to go out into the world and encounter all the things I'm going to experience in the world feeling upset and angry? Or do I want to find a way to get over all of that so that my immune system and my body-mind system are functioning at a much higher level? That's the direction that we need to be thinking about as we move forward. States of consciousness are states of the body. We get to choose. Isn't that cool? Especially in light of what's been going on in the world around us in the years 2020 and 2021. All right, well, sadly, that's it for today's show. The next time we get together, we'll explore a unique and controversial model introduced by a man named Julian Jaynes that suggests, to paraphrase a New Testament line, that the left brain knoweth not what the right brain does. So we're going to be talking about the bicameral mind and how that has influenced the development of culture and how that has influenced individual development as we continue with this series on Noetic Moments, produced here in the studios of KXCR in beautiful Florence, Oregon. We are out of time for today, but remember, you can continue the exploration on our website, www.noeticmoments.org, where there's a list of the titles and other resources we refer to on each show, along the archived past shows. So you go to a show and there's the list. And you can use the form on that site to send me your comments and questions, which I'll do my best to get answered the next time we're on the air. And I'll let you know which program you got that answer in. For now, thanks for joining me here on Noetic Moments. I hope you have a wonderful week.
You've been listening to Dr. Ruth Miller's Noetic Moments. This program is produced in the studios of KXCR Community Radio in beautiful Florence, Oregon, supported by you, our listeners. Our theme music is Tumbling Planets, composed and performed by Jeff Lovejoy. To hear this program again or learn more about Noetic Sciences, search our website, www.noeticmoments.org.